Hey friends, it's Matthew here. Today I'm going to talk about what I learned in my Intro to Psychology class this week. Our homework prior to class was reading chapter 1 of this book here. It's called Introductory Psychology by Spencer Rathis. We're using the 6th edition for this class. You can flip through the book and see a lot of good information. This page has a picture of a bird on it. That's pretty cool. And so our class just talked about the assigned reading and discussed what we learned a little bit, and so that's what I'm going to do today. Now, chapter 1 covered a lot of the fundamentals, and one of the fundamentals is learning just the definition of psychology. If we're going to study it, maybe we ought to know what it means. So what is psychology? Well, I learn now that psychology is the scientific study of mental processes and behavior. Why do we think the things we think? Why do we do the things we do? Why do we feel the ways we feel? All of this can be explained by psychology. Now, another one of the fundamentals that we learned is there are some concrete goals to this field of study. And those goals are as follows. It is to describe, it is to explain, it is to predict, and it is to control. Psychology aims to describe, explain, predict, and control mental processes and behaviors. Now, the book makes an important note that I feel like I should bring up too, which is when we talk about controlling mental processes, controlling behaviors, we're not talking about some crazy mind control experiments to get people to do what we want them to do. The control here is more talking about if you have somebody that is experiencing anxiety, or maybe they have depression, through psychology, we can learn to control that anxiety. We can control the depression. We can make it a little bit more manageable for the person or patient. And in doing this, we're helping the person live life to the fullest. So as you can see, psychology can do a lot of good for people. I'm going to erase all this here, because there's a couple more terms we ought to define. We learned psychology is the study of behavior and mental processes. And that's well and good, but just what the heck are behaviors and mental processes? Well, I learned in class this week that behaviors are our actions, the things that we do. These are measurable and observable things that a person outside of our minds can look at and see. While mental processes, these are more subjective. It's how we perceive the world. It is our private thoughts and emotions. Somebody outside our mind can't see, measure, or observe mental processes like they can with behaviors. Now I'm going to erase these and we'll talk about a couple examples as we did in class. So maybe you can read my handwriting on the whiteboard here, but it says, avoiding speaking in front of a group. Now, is that a behavior or is that a mental process? Well, when we talked about it in class, we learned that avoiding speaking in front of a group is a behavior, because that's something that we can measure, it's something that we can observe. We can see if somebody's going out of their way to avoid speaking in front of a crowd. Seems pretty straightforward to me. Let's look at another example. Experiencing anxiety when taking a test. Is this a behavior or is it a mental process? Well, we learned in class that this is an example of a mental process. Because somebody's anxiety, that's a thought or emotion. It's something that's happening in their head. Somebody outside that person's head can't really see or measure the anxiety that they're experiencing. Now, if this example said something like, they experience anxiety when taking a test and they tap their foot, or maybe they get a little bit sweaty or they're kind of fidgety or something like that, that would be an example of behavior. We could notice that. We could observe that. If they're tapping their foot, that's something that we could see. That would make it a behavior. But in this instance, simply experiencing the anxiety, that's all going on in their head. You and I wouldn't be able to observe that. So therefore, this is a mental process. So this is all pretty cool stuff that we're learning here. We're really understanding the fundamentals of psychology. And what we learned next in class was that there are 6 schools of thought in psychology. A school of thought is essentially an area of concentration. It's a certain perspective that psychologists will look at when understanding these mental processes and behaviors. And so just give me a minute to write them all out on the board here. Now, maybe you can see on my whiteboard I have the 6 different schools of thought in psychology written out here. There might be more schools of thought. I don't know, this is just what we learned in class, but it seems to cover a lot of different aspects of psychology, all right here. So first, let's talk about behavioral psychology. Now this is talking a little bit about what we just learned. It's about studying observable, measurable behavior. Now a lot of behavioral psychology talks about how the environment influences the things that we do. And a lot of this relates to learning. For example, how does reinforcement in children help with learning? How do things like modeling or imitation influence learning? It's very much built around how does the environment influence the things that we do. Up next we have psychodynamic psychology. This looks at our conscious and unconscious motivations. It asks questions like, how does our childhood influence the way we perceive the world now? Why do we have anxiety? What causes us to act aggressively? Things of that nature. This is some really metaphysical stuff that it gets at. Up next we have cognitive psychology. This really focuses on the mental processes that happen in our heads. How do we perceive the world? How do we plan for the future? How do we remember things in the past? What goes on in our head that leads us to make decisions or make judgments about things? Cognitive psychology looks at the brain as a sort of information superhighway and asks how are all of these things connected and how do they influence each other. Up next we have humanistic psychology. This is some pretty groovy stuff here. Our book talks about this school of thought in relation to intrinsic motivation, the inherent desire within all of us to do better. I like to think of this in terms of empowerment. Humanistic psychology teaches us that we all have the power and free will to make choices every day. We can use those choices to exercise self-control and to do other things, little things each day to better ourselves. And by exercising self-control, by doing various types of self-improvement, we can boost our self-esteem when we recognize how much power that we have to change ourselves. And after changing ourselves, maybe we realize we have the power to change the world around us as well. And by doing all of this, it guides us to the path towards self-actualization, which is reaching your fullest potential, being the best version of yourself that you can possibly be. What a beautiful thought that is. Up next we have evolutionary psychology. This looks at our mental processes and behaviors through the lens of natural selection. Do we think and feel things as a result of evolution? Being able to discern what emotions somebody is experiencing is an example of this. If we're able to tell what somebody is thinking or feeling, we can potentially use that to remove ourselves from a dangerous situation, and this helps with our survival. Evolutionary psychology looks at stuff like that and a whole lot more. Up next we have biological psychology. This looks at the physical structures of the brain, the nerve processes, hereditary traits, hormones, things that we can really measure and get the numbers for. An easy example of this is hormones. When we go through adolescence, our bodies are flooded with hormones. Biological psychology asks the question, how do these hormones influence our behavior? How do they influence the way we think and feel about things? Another example would be, let's say we have a guy who has treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder, and no treatment we're giving him is working. What would happen if we gave this guy some psychedelic mushrooms? Would this change the brain chemistry in his mind? Would this create new neural pathways in his brain? These are all things biological psychology can take a look at. Last, we have sociocultural psychology. This field of psychology asks the question, how does society and its cultural values influence our mental processes and behaviors? A great example of this came in the 1940s, when Dr. Mamie Phipps Clark conducted what's now commonly known as the doll experiment. Back in the 1940s here in America, we still had segregated schools, and Dr. Clark wanted to see what the psychological effects of this were on our black and brown children in this country. And so she took a bunch of black children and showed them a white doll and a black doll and said, "Show me the pretty one." And in most cases, these black children would point to the white doll instead of the black one, the one that maybe looks a little bit more like them. And she pointed to this as evidence for how this segregated system we were living in was creating low self-esteem in our black children. And this study was actually cited in the landmark Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board of Education, that determined that our racist, separate but equal school systems were causing psychological damage to our black and brown brothers and sisters in this country. This all helped pave the way to move towards an integrated society here in the United States. Now, we still have a lot of work to do to create a society that is truly equal and fair for everybody. But Dr. Mamie Phipps Clark, her research proved invaluable to the field of sociocultural psychology, as it seemed to prove that if you live in a society with racist cultural values, it will cause psychological harm to the affected races. Well, that's just about all we learned this week in my Intro to Psychology class. I think next week's going to be a continuation of Chapter 1, and I look forward to learning more about the exciting fundamentals of psychology. But I think now, it's time for me to go outside and take a peek at the sky. There's supposed to be a full moon tonight. I hope if you get a chance, you can go outside and see it yourself too. Until next time, have a good week, everybody.